NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Good morning. Just an update on that. The article that a lot of you might be interested in, a lot of you probably have it. I don't know how many have it, The Right to Present a Defense. It's on my website. A lot of people find it very useful. So it's a public service announcement, I guess. Just some of the point here, some of the slides here come from Dr. Ami Klin. Dr. Ami Klin, I got a lot of material from him. He was the individual who originally authored the definition of Asperger's syndrome for DSM-4 in 1994. Just this past week on Monday in Fort Myers on a case, I heard a prosecutor tell me, well, you know, Asperger's syndrome or autism, it's the defense du jour. Somehow this has gotten into the water. Even this judge who said this in Cedar Rapids had never had a case involving Asperger's or autism, but somehow had in their head that this was the, quote, defense du jour. But that's what you're struggling against. And everything everybody said so far about representing people with mental health issues absolutely applies in this scenario. But the thing that I think was most important here is the differentiation between autism and other kinds of disorders or issues that might come up. And it's, in my view, it's the science of this that makes the difference. If you think you can go to a prosecutor, no matter how long you've known them, and however much that person's a good old boy or whatever, just talk about how pathetic your client is and how sad this is, it's not going to carry the day, not in that area of child exploitation, whether it's child pornography or sexting or solicitation on the internet. So forget about it. You've got to get into the science is what makes the difference here. And of course, there's that problem that we look at, like in death penalty cases, we look at mental health issues as mitigating factors. For them, it's what? Aggravating factors. So they think people are dangerous. So you got to deal with that. Autism, it keeps going up, the prevalence of autism. Before 2017, it was 1 in 68. What's happening is that more people, non-white people basically, are getting diagnosed with autism as the schools and systems get better. Most of these people are, quote, high functioning, meaning they have language skills, they have intelligence. Most people on the autism spectrum are of above average or above average intelligence. So getting into this, so because of the importance of the science, the bulk of what I'm going to do today really introduces you to some of the science of this. And so the first thing I'm going to show you is some research was done by Dr. Klin at the Yale Child Study Center with others. And basically, the issue was, we know that for autistic people, there's an issue of eye contact. It's very commonly said, well, you know, they don't look you in the eye. And there's one book by a guy with autism saying, you know, the title of the book is Look Me in the Eye, because that was his life. People tell him, look him in the eye. So what's that all about? So the research compared the eye gaze patterns of typically developed people compared to autistic people. Then they did this by doing a scene out of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So look at this clip and basically see what it's telling you. So what do we look at when we look at this sort of this social scene with this, you know, complicated relationships between people? He's pointing, he's talking to Richard Burton. Well, what happens is, the yellow is the typically developed people, the green is the autistic people. Typically developed people are watching, going from the eyes of the speaker to the person they're speaking to. And then they follow where he's giving this directional cue. And this is like this technology is eye tracking technology developed by the Air Force. It measures in milliseconds. So if you saw it, they have a live version, it shows the eye moving around a lot. So the autistic person, the eyes are going from the mouth of George Siegel generally up into the direction of the picture. So we see this sort of pattern. The other scene where Richard Burton is in the background, it's all about what is he thinking. His wife is flirting with this guy. What is he thinking? So that this typically developed people are going back and forth looking at the eyes because they're anticipating what kind of reactions can I see on Richard Burton among these three people. The autistic person is not looking at the very thing that gives meaning to that social scene to us. They're looking at the mouth, they're getting the words, they're not getting all those cues that give meaning to that event. So the first thing to understand is we're not deciding what to look at. We are looking at the brain is telling us what to look at. And the brain of the autistic person is shutting out that information, having them look at the area that gives them the word so they can try to catch the meaning of that situation. Lots of other studies have done eye tracking about consistently people looking at their mouths. They don't recognize emotions because of this. They don't recognize faces as well. They can't memorize faces. They can't distinguish between faces. They don't see gender in faces. Faces, the memory process by recognizing faces involves different parts of the brain for these individuals. They piece together from parts of the face that are sort of objects. They look at photographs. They don't get emotional cues or social cues from the scene in photographs. Amazingly, later in 2017, there was new research done by Dr. Klein and John Costantino in St. Louis doing a study of twins. Fraternal or identical twins, there's a 9.9 correlation, which is like almost 100% correlation between what they look at in a social scene. Two twins, separate rooms, looking at the same scene. Their eyes are going to look at, with a 90% correlation, the same thing as their identical twin. If you drop down to fraternal twins, it drops down to 35% or something. And if you take out the family relationship, it drops to 0. A very high genetic correlation between what our eyes look at. And so autism is most highly genetic of the developmental disabilities. But this shows that there's something very, very special going on in how our eyes look at things. And with autism, with the interruption, the neurology in autism is what changes what they look at. So it's a very striking thing. So what's this all about? When we have social encounters with other people, we pick up on nonverbal social cues, the eye movements, the lips, intonation, body posture, and all that stuff. But there's so much of this. It comes really, really fast. But we process that and we learn how people feel. We learn how they think. We learn what their intentions are. We develop the ability in our mind to imagine what it's like to be that person. Reciprocally, in engaging that process, we also learn how to express our own feelings. We see how other people express their feelings. It affects the way we express ourselves and our ability to express our emotions. Without that, we have flat affect. But that's a learning process. And of course, part of that process, too, is in going at different social ages, there are more social demands as we get older, getting into the areas of, say, intimacy and romance, sexual relationships, and so on. And this really starts in infancy. Dr. Klein, you can look up his TED Talk. It's referred to in my materials as a TED Talk where he talks about diagnosing autism in infants based on eye tracking and watching how little babies, even before they can talk, they can communicate by getting the attention of a caregiver. They look at the eyes of people. They focus on the eyes. And they look at where if somebody points at an object, they follow that point. And they don't just get a directional cue as to where that object is. They get a sense of the meaning of that thing in the mind of the person that's talking to it. So they not only get a sense in infancy, before they can even talk, and as toddlers, they get a sense of how people think, how people are motivated, what's going to affect their behavior and their own feelings, and basically how to get the attention of others to get what they want in the world. They become social beings. And when it comes down to it, the people we are now are the product of those thousands and thousands of social interactions we've had since infancy coming up to our current time. That's who we are. The problem is the brain is different in the person with autism. There's areas, neural pathways in the brain on the left is Temple Grandin, most famous autistic person in the United States. Claire Danes played her in a movie. And the right is the control brain. There's a problem with neurons. The suspicion is it's a problem of not pruning the neurons. When you are born, in the first few months, your brain sheds a lot of neurons in the brain. There are a lot of neurons and pathways going all over the place with Temple Grandin's brain. It's a disruption in sensory processing. So it's also, most of these individuals, almost all of them, have slow processing in the frontal lobe. And that slow processing shows up on intelligence testing because they measure timing for tasks and so on. So anyway, the slow processing of that, all that heavy, dense visual, nonverbal cues that we rely on to have productive reciprocal social interactions that's blocked out. Why? Because it's too much. Their brain can't process it fast enough, so it's just too confusing. The example I give is when I was just starting to walk, my mother saw me bump into doorways. And the answer was I was slightly cross-eyed, so I was seeing double. And what happened eventually, they tried to adjust it in a lot of different ways, amblyopia it's called. And eventually what happens is I still have the same problem. My eyes are slightly cross-eyed, but I don't bump into doorways because my right eye dominates. So my right eye covers from here over to here, then my left eye picks up. If I close my right eye, my left eye can see the whole room. But the brain shields out that confusing information so I don't bump into doors. Same thing happens with autistic individuals. The brain cannot handle all that information, so the brain just blocks it out. And so what we're dealing with people with autism is the consequences of having a brain that shields out all that social information that we rely on to understand the world, understand other people, and to a large extent understand ourselves. And so this is called mind blindness. It's a one term. It's not being aware of how other people think. It derives from this neurological problem. Yesterday, Jennifer mentioned System 1 and System 2 thinking. The System 1 thinking is the intuitional thinking that we get automatic, that we use 95% of the time. And System 2 is the rational, labored evaluation process, weighing of evidence, thinking about rules, and so on. This comes from Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman got the Nobel Prize in 2002 for economics. He wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he talked about these kinds of systems. And the real important thing about Kahneman when he talked about this is that intuitive thinking. Where does that come from? Kahneman gave a lecture talking about intuitive thinking, and he talked about what was involved in how this intuitive thinking that 95% of the daily life, where that comes from. And he basically says the same thing.
One of the things that were not entirely clear to us when we started, and that have become a lot clearer now,
says about learning intuition,
is that there are really two ways that thoughts come to mind. So that's one way that a thought can come to mind. And it involves orderly computation and doing things in stages and remembering rules and applying rules. And then there is another way that thoughts come to mind. And you see this lady, and she's angry. And you know that she's angry as quickly as you know that her hair is dark. And furthermore, so there is no sharp line between intuition and perception. You perceive her as angry. Perception is predictive. You know what she's going to say, or at least you know something about what it's going to sound like. And so perception and intuition are very closely linked. It's really, in my mind, there never was a very clean separation between perception and intuition. And that, I should add, because the social context we're in here, you can't ignore evolution in anything that you do or say. But for us, certainly for me, the main thing, the evolutionary story about intuition, was that intuition grew out of perception, and that it grew out of the predictive aspects of perception.
So from the just general talking with experts in autism, I got the idea that not having reciprocal social interpersonal skills somehow rolls up into not understanding social norms and social taboos, which is the problem with the autistic individual. When I got to Kahneman came to my attention in other ways, but this where we see that this intuitive way of thinking that covers 95% of our mental operations during the day is based on intuition, which is based on social perception. Only then do you really get a sense of the pervasiveness of the disruption in social survival skills for the autistic individual, because they do not have access to that intuitive social thinking about the world. That's gone. And one of the things I constantly am talking to prosecutors, and I just told it to a judge on Monday in Fort Myers, when the judge never knew me before. I walk into the courtroom and I said, Judge, when I walked into that courtroom, you sized me up. You started thinking about, am I Am I an asshole? Am I like some of my writings? Am I really disrespectful of you, like some of my emotions, and so on? And what kind of person am I? What am I going to do? Am I going to behave in the courtroom? Am I going to be respectful? All that thinking that comes automatically to that judge, the autistic individual is not capable of. It's not part of the way their mind works. So they see a completely different world than we do. And that lays the groundwork for everything that we do in trying to effectively represent these individuals. Because what happens is, from birth, they're not making that eye contact. They're not learning these social relationships. They don't play with their peers. They don't get their perspectives. They don't have creative play or interactive play with other kids. They don't develop bonds with their peers. They don't then learn intimacy, romance, and all those things that are necessary for productive emotional interchange with other people. Instead, they begin to focus on things. And one of the things that Dr. Klin says in his lecture is that for us, there's a big difference between people and things. But for children with autism, that distinction is not so clear. And so they become experts not in people, not in relationships. They become experts in things. And vacuum cleaners is very common. And going down eventually to computers, where they find those logical, syntactical, rule-based world of computers be very warm and accepting, a place where they can get around because they doesn't have all that complicated nonverbal stuff. So they end up having this extreme social immaturity. They don't learn about sex and romance in the locker room the way we do. They can't read people. They don't see the social implications of things. There's something else I'm going to show you that illustrates this. So they just really, again, see a different kind of world. We've seen in The Big Bang Theory and in the new Netflix show Atypical, we learn a lot about what autistic individuals are like, the more higher functioning people. And don't be misled by higher functioning, and we'll come to that in a second. But this idea of not being able to, being awkward, physically awkward, they have these social learning deficits. They can get involved in collecting very intense interests in things like roller coasters, baseball cards. They may know everything about cameras and never take a picture. That one of my clients had 20,000 baseball cards, never watched a baseball game. So it's unproductive kind of interest. They are very rule-bound. Rule-bound is very, very important. They have rigid thinking, which makes it very difficult to deal with them as a client. But the thing about them being rule-bound is, and I'll talk a little bit, I think, about why they're rule-bound, but that's the kind of thing. Autism gets them into trouble, but this tendency to be rule-bound and adhering to strict routines is what guarantees that they're not going to get in trouble again. It's something prosecutors and judges really need to learn. Sensory processing issues, just as they have problem processing visual cues, there's a disruption in a lot of sensory systems. They can be highly, highly sensitive to light, sound, touch, textures. Parents think, oh, my child was a picky eater. It was all about textures or tastes that were bad for them. Some are hyposensitive. They get burnt a lot because they don't feel heat or cold as much. They might break a wrist and not complain about it. So sensory disruption is a big part of it, and it's part of the communication problem too, because as several of my clients have said, it's not just that I am trying to get the words, we don't hear the fans, we don't hear the cars out in the street, we don't hear people clicking their pens, we don't hear people chewing gum or the clinking of silverware. That all drops out. For some of them, this is agony. I had a client in court who my co-counsel was chewing gum. This guy had misophonia, which is high sensitivity, especially to chewing. He couldn't eat with other people. He had to eat in a separate room. He was biting it. It was so painful to him. He was biting his finger to distract himself, and his finger was bleeding. He didn't wear long pants or long sleeve shirts in the wintertime in upper New York. So just something about this from this movie about what this comes out to be like. So the problem then for us becomes that they don't have this social sense. They're not uncaring, but they just don't notice how other people are, what other people need. If they're told, they do have empathy, which distinguishes them from sociopathic people who know very well how other people feel and take advantage of that to manipulate them and don't care how it affects them. But anyway, they're not going to learn in the locker room, as I said before, what we do about romance and sex and so on. They're very isolated. They don't learn these social norms. They turn to the internet. They want to learn about sex and romance, and they'll look at pornography. They'll see child pornography, and the red flags don't go up. The things that would tell typically developed people, stay away, there's something dangerous about that, if it's wrong or it's bad, or people disapprove of that, it's just not there for them. On social media, chat rooms, interest groups, and so on. Age difference, age of consent doesn't make any difference to them. They don't get it. First of all, because they're socially very, very immature and they gravitate toward a younger set anyway. So they have, it's a real problem for them because they just don't see the boundaries that we think are innate, but they're not. They're socially learned boundaries. They're culturally determined. So this was mentioned yesterday, at least in the context of IQ, the migration from strict rules about when IQ is too low for somebody to be competent or too low for criminal responsibility and so on, and the discussion about, well, it's adaptive function, how well somebody actually functions in the world. So a lot of people think about, okay, it's autism, and then they run with that and don't look at the most important thing, which is not necessarily the autism, but the effect in terms of social functioning. There are a lot of conditions, Klinefelter syndrome, nonverbal learning disabilities, other kinds of disabilities that result in lack of social capabilities. So we have these standardized tests. Vineland is the most common, and ABAS is another, and some of these other side things that measure the adaptive testing. And basically, the most important areas that we're concerned about are in the communication area, receptive language, how well you understand what other people are telling you. And in the social realm, they might be very good in daily living skills, but the next is social, and there it's the interpersonal. The interpersonal relates to how well you communicate reciprocally with other people, and that is the skill that boils up to, rolls up into this kind of social intuition. Typically, the autistic individuals, if you look at a lot of the research that's done, and they tell the demographics of the population that they're treating as their autistic standard, they will talk about their social adaptation skills. Typically, they're about a quarter of their chronological age in terms of their ability to understand social scenes, understand what's happening in a social encounter. For the people that I see and the people we're going to see, because they are ignorant of the most severe social taboos, they're even worse in terms of their social, interpersonal social skills. They're going to be literally at the level of toddlers most of the time, 1 to 3 years of age in terms of their age equivalent of their social skills. Now, prosecutors will say, or the judges will say, well, he doesn't act like a child. He knew it. He drove a car. He has a master's degree. Or he got through high school. He may have failed through high school. He may have got a graduate degree. So a big problem when you get Vineland scores like this, often it's shocking to parents. Parents can't believe it because parents are always looking at the competency of their child. They're looking at the positives. They really don't test out how the social things, how these social skills are measured. So I give the example of Tom Hanks in Big, a 12-year-old or whatever, automatically in a 30-year-old body trying to navigate the social scene. And that gives you sort of a metaphor for that. Or it's really, I think, better is somebody from a different culture. So I don't know how many for you think this is one of your favorite movies, but there's a scene in here that sort of conveys this, that Clint Eastwood dealing with this Hmong family that lives next door. And so the girl who's befriended him comes up and talks to him. She's going to take him next door. So the Hmong people believe that the soul resides at the top of the head, and he thinks that's dumb. They don't. And I said, I was in a meeting with prosecutors in Kansas City, and one of the prosecutors had said to me, when I gave all this talk, he said, well, I think he should know in his soul that looking at child pornography is wrong. So I said, well, do you like Clint Eastwood? And I showed him this clip. And I said, do you think Clint Eastwood should have known in his soul that it was wrong to touch that child on the top of his head, her head? But this is the problem of being in a different culture. And another way to illustrate this is more research was done by Dr. Klin for us to really experience in a certain way the difference, the way they see the world. It was a test that was done using something that actually been done by a couple of German psychologists back in the 40s. But you're gonna see this is a little cartoon. There's some figures in it. There's 2 triangles, a circle, and a box. All right, and it's the last 50 seconds. And so watch this and see what comes to mind. The idea of theory of mind, the idea of that we tend to think about what other people are thinking. We want to know what other people are thinking. We have the ability to somewhat put ourselves in their shoes. The idea of theory of mind is the idea of being able to see mental states in the people around us and sometimes in the things around us. And our brain cannot resist personifying and looking for the mental in things around us. That's the way our brains work. A typical 14-year-old child with an average IQ does this automatically. Describing this, there's mental states: bully, shy, scared, standing up for oneself, jealous, pick on, upset, and creates a story, a human story from moving geometric objects. The little triangle got upset and said, "Hey, what's up? Why are you doing this?" This is a child and how the typical brain works. An autistic child, same IQ, same age, is completely different. Now, the interesting thing about this is that even when the autistic child is later given cues about what this is about, well, we're trying to see if, maybe there are relationships here. Maybe let's pretend maybe these would be, instead of objects, they were people. And we're looking to see relationships. They still will only marginally improve in their ability to identify the social cues in this. There's a whole set of social cues. This was never standardized. I really wish it would be. But I've given this to, let me go further. So here's the idea that remember that thing about the trajectories of the social increase in social relationships, as opposed to thinking about objects and eventually being housed in the world of computers. Well, this is the problem of thinking about things versus thinking about people. The other thing is, well, maybe they get better when they get older. Here's a 38-year-old. And we have the same stuff because the brain hasn't changed. The neurology hasn't changed. The ability to think, the mind has not changed. The brain has not changed to think about the mental operations and things. They don't see the world that we see. They grow up on the wrong planet. And if you want to find more about how autistic individuals think, how they experience the world, there's a website by autistic individuals for autistic individuals. Nathan McConnell is an autistic artist who does comics. And I've talked to Nathan, and this is a comic where he depicts the typically developed people as blank faces, masks, and then himself is normal. And he said, well, I was hoping part of that was that's the way I see people, because I don't see the things that you see in people, and hopefully maybe they'll see me as normal when they look at my comic strip. But the comic is also about, he's talking to 2 guys who talk, I like to shoot. I could imagine shooting people from a mile away. All those things now we attribute to, the autistic school shooters or tower shooters or whatever. And the other one said, yeah, I like to shoot. And then he says, well, I'm into martial arts, and I do I do keep a chain whip on me. And they say, well, that's creepy. You're weird. So, and he says, so who's stupid? Who's empathic and not, compared to autistic versus regular people? But anyway, they see the world differently. They do not see the world we do. And the biggest thing that prosecutors and judges need to understand is that very fact, that they really grew up on the wrong planet. They did not experience the world that we experience. And so this concept, counterfeit deviance, was a concept that was originally in the diagnostic manual for intellectual disorders, also published by the APA, as coined by a psychologist named Dorothy Griffiths, who's in Canada. And counterfeit deviance, the concept of that we see people that do deviant things, and we assume that they are thinking deviant thoughts, but it's not true with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So this phrase, counterfeit deviance, is just a phrase coined as a sort of a differential diagnosis from paraphilias when it comes to this kind of behavior that appears to be sexually deviant. This is a quote from Denise Kelleher, psychiatrist in California. So, and so this runs into problems because the individuals with autism, they don't understand the norms that we understand, and they get into problems. So he goes home, she later comes back, brings him the box that he left there, and he talks to her about his autism and how it's misunderstood. He doesn't understand other people's perspective. He talks about mind blindness and that a lot of people, were very creative and so on and didn't understand the social world, like Da Vinci and Galileo and Thomas Jefferson. And she says, are they all autistic? And he said, probably. So who knows? Anyway, so what we have in this case, this is why I call this a perfect storm. We have this highly pressured, hydraulically pressured law enforcement regime, which is very ideological, cookie cutter. In fact, I say prosecutors become autistic. They become very rigid, blind to other people's perspective, and black and white thinking, and they don't want to change their routines. So anyway, on the other hand, we have these individuals who don't know they're doing anything wrong. They're extremely naive. They gravitate toward younger people as a less threatening social scene. They're interested in sex, and so they look for it, and they find it in the wrong places. And they transgress boundaries that they're not aware of. They collect, and they complete their collections. So if numbers of images are the thing, that they get very harshly dealt with there. And of course, there's always the idea that because they're odd, because they're different, difference means dangerousness. So they are one of the things that's it's almost pathognomonic for those who are autistic is being bullied in high school and bullied in grade school. They are always victims in every social setting. The theory of the Bureau of Prisons, we put all the sex offenders together, they'll be okay to each other. Well, it doesn't work. These guys get victimized wherever they go. They end up spending most of the time in solitary confinement because they don't know what to do with them. They because they're rule followers and rule bound, they will squeal on other inmates who break the rules. They'll squeal on the guards who break the rules because they all break the rules. And then they become the complainer, and then they get, nobody's going to watch out for their own interests. Under sex offender registration laws, they're not eligible for HUD vouchers, with which they would be entitled to with a disability. They can't get into therapy programs because all the autism programs deal with children. They will can't do the kind of therapies that require the socialization, which requires being in the community. They can't have trouble enough getting and keeping a job in any event. Obviously, they're not going to get jobs. And they most often cannot live independently. So they're dependent on their parents, and their parents worry when they're gone what happens to the children. So that's why it's a perfect storm. The typical case is very, I think it's probably very predictable. Collections of child pornography might be very large, but there'll be a mixture. Usually it's lots of adult pornography. There may be issues of sexting with underage kids. The case I had on Monday in Fort Myers, this was a 11-year-old girl. There's a lot of this has to do with the internet and what's happening on the internet. There's a lot of studies on that with the rate at which very young kids between 11 and 16, about 20% have exchanged sexually explicit images. They are routinely getting these images. They're used to it. There's all these kids between, prepubertal kids are doing sexual role play on the internet. They're going onto Omegle and Chat Roulette, and they're pairing up with other people, and because the one girl, a 9-year-old girl said, well, I thought, I probably was never going to meet the guy. This is a 9-year-old girl who said, this is in another case that's in Orlando, said to this guy, I wish my tongue was long enough to wrap around you. This is a 9-year-old girl. Where'd she learn this? On the bus. So we have typically developed kids in an environment where the internet is flooded with explicit sexual activity, and they drop in that without any preconceived a priori understanding of social norms from the outside into the internet, where there are no rules, where it's all the age leveling, it's anonymous, everything's permitted, and they do not see any boundaries. So this case in Fort Myers, 11-year-old girl and her friends thought they would have fun by messing with some pervs. They pick them at random to send on a website. They send them pictures of themselves. She describes herself as a 19-year-old college student. He can't tell the difference from the pictures because he happened to be deaf and partly blind and cerebral palsy in addition to his autism. And he just got 135 months on Monday. So this is why it's a perfect storm for these individuals. Unfortunately, the case I got into only at the sentencing stage. So, and well, we know how that all breaks out. Typically, the Vineland scores are toddler level for social, reciprocal social skills. So the point here is that isn't moral blameworthiness the foundation of our criminal law? And how do we justify treating as criminals those who don't understand they're transgressing these boundaries? Also, a big thing that I try to advance, it hasn't devolved into motion practice yet, but the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act, which is they're basically congruent, talk about protection of the disabled and not criminalizing people just on account of their disability. The Department of Justice, the Civil Division of Department of Justice, in interpreting these acts, has said that prosecutors must minimize unnecessary jail time. They must seek diversion. Courts and prosecutors must seek diversion from criminal processes for people who are developmentally disabled. This is the top people in the civil division. There's not too much conversation going on between them and the criminal division. And the people who said this, people like Sally Yates, are not there anymore. But this is an issue that's never really been explored formally in these cases. So it's an area that I always talk to prosecutors about. They'll try and brush it off, but back in my mind is somewhere along the line a motion to a judge to have a hearing to review whether or not the prosecution has actually gone to the business of taking into account developmental disabilities and exercise of their discretion. The other thing is explaining to prosecutors that while autism explains why the person is involved in this behavior, because they don't understand social norms, they don't see the world that we see, they're also very rule-bound. So once they do understand the rules, they will follow them. And if you talk to anybody, special ed, somebody who deals with autistic individuals, they will repeatedly say this again. They follow the rules. They want to know the rules. Why do they want to know the rules? Because individuals like this, when they do not have social intuition to get them through the day, they have two choices, basically. One is to just imitate other people and do what they do, hoping it somewhat fits within the social context, which, by the way, is why they will say things in chat rooms or say things in text exchanges with other people that sound manipulative and sophisticated, but they're just copying what other people have said. So these are called social scripting. They borrow phrases and borrow concepts from other things people have said on social media sites, Disney movies, TV shows. They say, well, some of these people know the full text of any Disney movie, because they want to pick up that language. So that's how people talk and communicate. Attached to my materials is a policy statement done by a bunch of autism researchers and organizations about 10 years ago, recommending diversion in first offender cases involving autism. So what's happened, we've had a number of cases, six federal cases and 2 other state cases where prosecutors have agreed to a plea of transportation of obscene material rather than a child pornography offense, which is not a sex offense, no registration, no jail. Several cases of dismissal recently in Houston, Austin. And prosecutors are not immune from being human beings and responding to this kind of thing. Plan B, the alternatives, competency. We've talked about a lot of talk about competency. One issue to be concerned about with competency, that's what the asterisk is that in some states, being found incompetent has the same result under SORA, under their statute, their thinking, which I think is totally wrong, as an insanity acquittal, which means that the person still goes on the registry. It's not right. I don't know how many states have it. This was, I think, Illinois or Missouri that had that. Anybody offhand know if they have a state that says somebody found incompetent still goes on the registry? Well, you got to look at that before you jump into competency. But competency has resulted in dismissal in Miami, Austin, maybe one coming up in Miami that I'm working on. But the advantage, the competency is a little bit different. It's not who's the judge, who's the prosecutor. are these issues that really relate to the autism. So memory, executive functioning, perspective taking, rigidity of thinking, being able to work with the lawyer in developing, in understanding what the theory is, understand the prosecution's theory. They're sometimes too literal. If they're going to be a witness, can they understand the perspective of the questioner? And there's also issues, by the way, of courtroom accommodations for individuals like this that I just won't really get into now, but they can't envision the consequences of pleas. They don't have that kind of fluid reasoning or part of the executive function where they really don't see the connection between the decision they make today and what's going to happen 10 years from now. So I always say the advantage of these issues is if you can tee up these issues as a way to, sometimes it's a way to educate the judge about that autism is present in this case. It's a different kind of case, which can be really important because what you need to handle one of these cases, the biggest thing you need is time. You need time to learn what you need to know, to do the things that need to be done, and to educate the prosecutor and the judge. And it just doesn't work on the normal schedule with which these cases are dispatched, especially if you're down in the Fourth Circuit, Fifth Circuit, 11th Circuit. So I try to hold off on actually formally. You don't want to raise competence if you don't have to, because you get on this, it gets a routine automatically. You get on a schedule. Okay, get the expert. Here's the hearing. And they get going on stuff that really is irrelevant. And not irrelevant, but it's really sort of beside the point. So if you can tee up the issue and use it as vehicle to get the judge and prosecutor to really focus on the autism, same with Miranda issues, then it might really be, that can really be useful. So a couple of things. I never want to get an offer from the prosecutor. I want to tell them, look, I need time. This is a different case. And I've helped other lawyers with letters. They can send to the prosecutor saying, look, I'm in over my head here. I don't know this stuff. It's going to take time to learn. I know this really bothers me because I don't think this kid knew he's doing anything wrong. Some things about autism. The point is you need to get time. You need to enlist the prosecutor to help you do that. One thing that has worked in some cases is getting with the prosecutor and proposing a schedule to the judge, a scheduling order. This has worked in federal court and in some state courts where if the parties get together and say, look, well, he says that the defense attorney says that the kid's got autism. I may want to get my own expert, but I want to see what he has to say, blah, blah, blah. And if you work out a schedule, you can sometimes take that. Some of these judges are so pushy about setting a trial date. And I try to say, set a status conference. Don't get us on trial date to trial date to trial date because there's so much lifting, as we know, moving from a trial date and getting that adjourned because you got to address, oh, I've got a jury coming and we've got our witnesses all called. You really need to avoid getting an offer from the prosecutor because they don't know. They know nothing. They say, oh, I've had people with Asperger's for autism before, very commonly heard, but I can tell you they really don't know anything about it. And the unfortunate fact is it's very, very unlikely that the defense attorney in the case that they had previously really went through all that they really need to know about this stuff. But you need to absolutely, whether in talking to your experts and in your own, on your own part, you really have to anticipate and understand their concerns, risks to children. They don't want to, they think that registration is important. They think it means something, even though it doesn't, even though registration may have an overall negative effect. And they are terribly afraid of the floodgates. They don't want to hear excuses in these cases, right? And they don't trust themselves to be able to differentiate between the people who really have autism or where they really have that lack of social functioning, where they really didn't know it was wrong. And so they don't want to, they don't feel they can make that decision. It's your job, ultimately, to have experts and show them that, yes, there can be a really definitive, very clear, very well supported, unchallengeable diagnosis and evaluation of the level of social functioning and what this person's real capabilities and understanding was. But you got to know that that's what they need to do, and you got to get the time to do it. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done to prepare for that. And I'm a firm believer in, before I tell them, I get them to commit me, agree to meet with me, agree to sit down with me and my expert. And then before that, I'm going to give you a memorandum that explains all this. And then we're going to sit down and we're going to talk about it. And I don't want to negotiate until that time because it's so important that you understand this stuff. And you are obligated under the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act to understand disabilities. Otherwise, how can you possibly fulfill your role of accommodating and taking them into account and exercising your discretion? So sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. You want to end up with a face-to-face meeting with your expert, with the prosecutor, And sometimes you get help from the judge in those motions for continuance, where you explain to the judge, here's why we need all this time. And some judges, I've said some judges were just terrific, just said, this is really concerning to me. I want to make sure everybody has enough time to thoroughly evaluate this. And those are the cases that end up well. Other opportunities to address this issue are bail or hearings. It's very hard very early in the case to get on board with that, but there are ways to do it. If you're aware of what's coming down the pike, there's my handout material gives you a lot of insight, things that you can use. But obviously, anybody can contact me. I got tons of stuff that would help in these situations. These clients are very difficult. A lot of lawyers who don't know anything about autism and really haven't any dealing with these people, it's sometimes very difficult. They think the biggest mistake is thinking, well, I'm just going to deal with my client and the parents are out here somewhere. I have a current client relationship with the client, and so I can't talk to the parents about what he's telling me. Totally wrong. The parents have to be on the team. The parents have to be intimately involved in this process. They have to be talking to their kid because they're going to be getting information out of their kid about their kid. Even they're 29 or 30, this is still a kid. They're going to be really big part of getting information you need in these cases. They have to be on the team, but sometimes they're symptomatic. That test of the triangles and squares and so on, it's very typical. I show it to the parents. In the one case in Green Bay, I showed it, and the father's watches it. He looks at me at the end when it's over, and he goes, "What?" I was like, so parents sometimes are symptomatic, and a lot of lawyers their initial reaction is the parents are meddling. They're naive as the realities of the criminal justice system, and they just have to get on board because this is what he's going to have to take a plea, and they just don't want to hear about it. So I'll actually tell you that I've had more headaches, lost more sleep, and had more agony over the local attorney the family originally hired that just simply wouldn't get on board with this than I ever had with a prosecutor. And it's a very, very sad situation. So, but these clients, you gotta deal with them. But they're the source of a lot of information you need. As I see here with parents, they're your ally, and they're going to help you by preparing a developmental history of their child. That don't rely on the expert to do this. There's too much. They don't have the time, especially if the person's confined. So we train parents to do their own developmental history, getting the records. We give them the diagnostic criteria. We tell them what to look for. Some parents, if the person hadn't been diagnosed before, all these odd behaviors are just the wallpaper. It's just the way he is. They didn't catalog them. They didn't categorize them in a way that's really useful for your understanding or to collect that information out. So you got to sort of educate them, and then we use that goes into the memorandum of the prosecutors. It goes into, if necessary, sentencing materials for the judge. But it's really helpful for the lawyer to begin to do what we need to do, is be able to think of what it's like to be that client. They have trouble thinking about what other people think, but we have to get into their head and try to understand how this individual thinks. Big issue in terms of this conference is the psychologist that you get as an expert to help you out. There's a lot of talk about this. I don't know if we have still some forensic psychologists here. I have had nothing but disasters with the standard forensic psychologists in dealing with this. They don't understand autism. They haven't done research work. They haven't done a history of clinical work and diagnosing and treating people with autism. They typically give these personality inventories, personality tests, like a Milan to somebody, and Milan's going to tell you this person has a dependent personality disorder, they have an avoidant personality disorder, and they'll come up with disorders that do not explain the behavior. They leave reams and tons of behavior and thinking of this individual not on the table, and they come up with some of these possible personality disorders or hair psychopathy checklist, things that really are not suited to people with autism, because autism is something that's a neurological condition. It's from birth. That's the thing that's the most pervasive effect on that individual's life. That's where you have to start. So it's rare to find the go-to forensic psychologist who has the history, has even learned how to administer the tests. And so it's incredibly important to have that person. And as also appropriate to what was said yesterday, no longer can you just say, well, you just give me a report. They have to understand what the prosecutor is looking for. They have to understand what the questions are. They have to get into the material. They have to get into what the exact behavior was, because they have to explain and you have to explain the worst of it. So they have to know exactly what the behavior was. What were the texts? What language did he use in texts and chatting with people? What kinds of images were there? And what were his habits? Did he organize the computer? Which is, we know that's BS, and we know that the research now shows clearly the number of images, the content of the images, the organization of the images has no relationship to recidivism or risk. Okay, the research is done, and so that should be put to rest. But those biases and so on are always present. So the expert has to be aware of these facts, and you have to really work with the expert. If they're new, if they haven't done this before, they're not forensic people. They don't want to go to court. Some will say you might have an excellent person in your town, maybe has treated the person, or there may be a good clinic there, somebody who's really good in the diagnostic and treatment modules, but I don't want to go to court. And you just have to explain to them the biggest threat to your client is not his mental health condition. It's the prosecutor or government that doesn't understand that condition. And that's what they really need to defend against. I do believe in sexual interest assessments. The ABLE screening has worked in a lot of these cases, and I think that you need to do that. I would say 90% of the time on an ABLE screening, which is, I don't want to get into methodological issues about that, but there are other visual reaction time tests out there. The methodology is sound, and it's been validated against the PPG. So, a lot of people use it. A lot of federal courts, it's a mandatory condition of supervised release to take the ABLE screening. Anyway, having those results, which will indicate 90% of my clients do not show an interest in prepubertal, which is the issue. That's the real issue. The interest in adolescence is not deviant, although I've had a number of them who weren't even interested in adolescence. But having that metric helps. I certainly believe in risk assessments. They're not validated against autistic individuals. They don't take into effect that rule-bound nature, and they have other aspects that score against developmentally disabled. Whether you've lived for 2 years in a relationship with somebody and so on, those things count against them. So I try to stay away from that. A lot of people that do ABLE screening, they want to do the whole psychosexual evaluation. If somebody does end up showing an interest in prepubertal material, then it's probably worth it to go through and do those other measures because that'll help out. Polygraph, very problematic. I've got a memo on that, but they often inconclusive. Got to find out what the client really thought. Find out his story. I just got to wrap it up here. You may have the ARC or other autism organizations in your community that can lean on the prosecutor. They don't want to. The major autism organizations have stepped out of this issue. Why? They don't want to stigmatize their population. It's a very sad state of affairs, but that's the problem. As I said, success is possible. We've had a lot of good results. A lot of cases, people getting probation, at least, in light of the autism issue. There's a book on this caught in the web. I wrote the introduction to it. I don't get any money out of it, but it's got a lot of information for you. And on my website, there's a paper I wrote in 2009 that has a lot of more background information other than the materials you have in your handouts. So I hope this all, you are going to see one of these people. And some of you are probably thinking, how many people think they've already had clients like this? Yeah. Okay. So there's a lot to talk about, and I wish you success in it.